The courthouse hallways of Cedar Falls, Iowa, buzzed with a kind of tension that didn't belong to a small Midwestern town. On most mornings, the old brick building smelled of coffee, paper files, and the faint lemon scent from the janitor's mop. But today, those familiar smells were swallowed up by something heavier: fear, uncertainty, and the unspoken weight of a truth no one could quite reach. Avery Collins, 3 years old, sat folded into one of the oversized wooden chairs outside courtroom 4B. Her little legs didn't reach the floor. Her pink sneakers hovered inches above the ground, gently swinging but never touching. She held her stuffed elephant, Ellie, in a firm, trembling clutch, its once white fur now a dull gray. Ellie had been washed twice, dried on low heat, brushed out with fabric softener sheets, but no amount of cleaning had removed the faint stain on its left ear. A stain that had appeared the night everything went wrong. Avery wouldn't talk about that night. Avery wouldn't talk about anything. Her mother, Julia Collins, sat beside her, eyes red-rimmed from another sleepless night. She kept smoothing Avery's hair, brushing the tiny golden curls off her daughter's forehead as if afraid that letting go, letting even one curl fall out of place, might cause Avery to retreat further inside herself. Trauma did strange things to a child. Silence was the most frightening of them. Detective Ruiz leaned against the opposite wall, arms crossed, gaze somber. He'd seen things in his 11 years on the force: broken homes, frightened children, the grim aftermath of crime scenes where innocence had been snuffed out like a candle. But something about Avery's case cut deeper. Maybe it was the sheer unfairness of a little girl being the only witness to a crime she shouldn't have even been awake to see. Maybe it was the way she shook every time a man passed by. Maybe it was her silence, her refusal to speak even a single word since she was found. Or maybe, Ruiz admitted to himself, it was because he had a daughter the same age. Judge Holloway, a tall and stern-looking man with white hair and the tired posture of someone who'd seen too much, peeked out from the courtroom door. His robe swayed as he stepped into the hallway. "Is she calm?" he asked quietly. Julia nodded, although nothing about her looked calm. As calm as she gets. The judge crouched slightly, lowering himself into Avery's eye level, something he'd learned from years of handling delicate cases involving children. "Good morning, Avery," he said gently. Avery didn't look at him. She didn't look at anyone. Her gaze remained fixed on her shoes, on the dust gathering under the bench, on anything that wasn't human. Ellie's worn fur was the only thing she seemed to trust. The judge sighed and stood again. "We need her statement today. We can't keep delaying, no matter how hard it is. The defense is already claiming there's no credible witness. If we don't get anything, we risk losing the case." He looked at Detective Ruiz. "Where, Officer Cole?" As if summoned, a set of measured footsteps approached from the far end of the hall. Officer Mason Cole appeared, wearing a dark blue uniform and a calm, steady expression that came from years working with children and trauma victims. But it wasn't Mason who drew everyone's attention. It was the dog walking beside him. Golden fur, soft eyes, gentle posture, Ranger looked less like a police K9 and more like the kind of dog a child might draw with crayons. His steps were slow, deliberate, and silent on the polished floor. He carried an aura of peace, a warm presence that softened the rigidity of the courthouse's cold walls. Ranger wasn't trained for aggression. He wasn't meant for takedowns or tracking suspects. He was a therapy K9, new to the department, on his 5th official case, and the last hope for a little girl who had shut the world out. Avery didn't notice Ranger at first. She kept her head down, breathing in sharp, shaky inhales as she traced circles on Ellie's ear with her finger. But then Ranger took one more step. And another. Then his nose lifted slightly, as if catching a familiar scent. The air changed. Avery's head rose, slowly, hesitantly, like a child who had forgotten there were safe things left in the world. Her eyes widened, pupils softening, a flicker of recognition sparkling through the fog of fear. Her grip loosened around Ellie. Ranger stopped 2 feet in front of her, tilted his head, and sat perfectly still. Mason watched carefully. This was the moment he'd been waiting for, the moment he hoped would break through the wall around Avery's small, terrified heart. Avery blinked twice. Her lips parted. A tiny whisper escaped. "Hi." Julia gasped. She slapped her hand over her mouth as tears filled her eyes. It was the first word Avery had spoken in 23 days. Ranger didn't move. He remained still as a statue, letting Avery lead the moment. She slid off the chair slowly, feet slipping into the cold floor with a soft tap. Her stuffed elephant dangled in one hand. She stepped forward closer, until she stood directly in front of Ranger. Then she touched his fur. The moment her fingers pressed into the golden coat, something invisible cracked, like a window long frozen beginning to thaw. She exhaled a trembling breath. Ranger responded by gently placing his paw on her foot, a deliberate gesture of connection. Detective Ruiz felt his chest tighten. "Good boy," he whispered, barely audible. The judge leaned toward Mason. "Let's bring her inside. If she's willing to interact with Ranger, she might talk." But the courtroom wasn't empty. It was full. Reporters, lawyers, officers, defense counselors, and a few members of the public. The case had spread quickly through local media. Nobody knew the full details, but everyone knew this. Avery Collins was the only witness to a crime involving someone who was dangerous, unpredictable, and still insisting on his innocence. Julia lifted Avery into her arms, but the little girl squirmed. She pointed down. "At Ranger." "She wants him next to her," Mason interpreted. The judge hesitated but eventually nodded. "He's certified for this. Bring him." As they walked through the courtroom doors, dozens of heads turned, some in pity, some in curiosity, some in skepticism. Avery's small face pressed against Ranger's fur as they approached the witness stand, her fingers clinging to him like a lifeline. Mason walked beside them, his hand steady on Ranger's leash. The judge raised his gavel but didn't strike. He didn't want the loud noise to startle her. "Proceed," he said gently. Julia carried Avery to the stand and set her down. Ranger laid at her feet instantly, as if he had been trained his entire life for her and only her. For a moment, just a moment, the courtroom held its breath. Avery's tiny hand lifted, her fingers brushing Ranger's ear, grounding herself. She looked up at the judge. Everyone waited for her to speak. But then Avery's eyes shifted. Her body stiffened. Her breathing halted. She stopped looking at the judge. She was staring past him, across the courtroom to the second row. Her hand began to tremble so violently that Ellie dropped to the floor. And with a voice so small and fragile it seemed to scrape the air, she whispered, "He's here." The entire courtroom froze. The courtroom's sudden silence pressed down on everyone like a physical weight. Officers stiffened, hands brushing the sides of their holsters, eyes scanning the second row. Avery's words, so small, so fragile, yet so piercing, had pierced through the hum of fluorescent lights, the shuffling of papers, and even the low murmurs of reporters. "He's here." Mason Cole's heart skipped a beat. He glanced toward the seat Avery had been staring at. The man there didn't flinch, didn't shift, didn't acknowledge the weight of the accusation. Ethan Ward, known to the department as dangerous, cunning, and unpredictable. Released on bail 2 weeks prior, he wasn't supposed to be in this building. At least, not here, not now. Avery's hand trembled violently as she reached toward Ranger, clutching his fur for safety. The golden retriever sat still, eyes calm and steady, as though he understood everything. Mason had worked with therapy canines before, but this connection, this unspoken language between a traumatized child and a dog, was beyond anything he'd seen. Ranger's ears twitched ever so slightly, his gaze locked on Avery, acknowledging her fear, letting her know she wasn't alone. Julia Collins stood frozen, her hand pressed to her mouth, Tears brimmed in her eyes, hot and urgent. "Avery," she whispered, trying to ground her daughter. "Honey, you're safe." Her voice wavered, and for the first time in months she couldn't continue. Not when her little girl had just pointed out a man in the courtroom as the source of her nightmares. Detective Ruiz stepped forward, keeping his voice low, deliberate. "Avery," he said, "can you tell us who you're pointing at?" The 3-year-old's lips quivered. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound emerged. She pressed her face into Ranger's fur, burying herself in his warmth, as if words were too heavy to carry alone. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. Cameras whirred quietly, reporters scribbled notes, officers glanced at each other, and Judge Holloway leaned forward, elbows on the bench, eyes narrowed with concern. Then Mason noticed something that nobody else seemed to catch. Ranger's tail, which had been still and relaxed, began a subtle, deliberate twitch. His body stiffened slightly, muscles tensing like a coiled spring. Mason's training kicked in instantly. The dog wasn't reacting to Avery. He was reacting to the man in the second row. "Ranger," Mason whispered under his breath, "show me." The dog shifted, his gaze never leaving Avery, but his body angled slightly toward Ethan Ward. Mason felt a chill crawl up his spine. This was more than instinct. This was recognition. Ranger had smelled something, something familiar, something dangerous. Avery's small hand found Ranger's ear again, kneading the fur as if seeking courage from him. She blinked rapidly, her blue eyes wide and shimmering, like she was balancing on the edge of some invisible precipice. Mason's stomach knotted. Every instinct in his body screamed at him, "Protect the child. Protect her at all costs." Then Avery whispered, just barely audible, so soft that only Mason seemed to hear. "Bad man." The words hung in the air, fragile yet seismic, like the tremor before an earthquake. Officers shifted, eyes flicking toward Ethan. He remained still, his expression unreadable, a thin line across his jaw. But Mason didn't need to see fear in him. He could feel it in the air, in the charged energy that had instantly blanketed the courtroom. Judge Holloway's hand hovered over his gavel. "Security," he said, his voice steady but sharp. "Please approach." 2 court marshals began moving down the aisle toward Ethan Ward. The man didn't flinch. He didn't move. He didn't even breathe in a way that betrayed awareness. Mason noticed Ranger's ears flatten just slightly. The dog let out a low, protective growl, not loud, not threatening, just enough to warn. Avery pressed closer to Ranger. "He's scary," she whispered. Julia's hands shook. "Honey, we're here," she said softly. "We're here." But Mason couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Ethan wasn't reacting like most people would. Most criminals, when confronted, would at least twitch, glance away, or show a flicker of fear. Ethan Ward didn't react. That stillness, that unreadable calm, was a warning in itself. Mason's mind raced. The marshals reached the aisle and began to approach him. But just as one of them extended a hand, Ethan Ward vanished. Vanished. It was impossible. Mason and Ruiz both froze, staring at the empty space where the man had been moments ago. The courtroom erupted into murmurs and gasps. Reporters fumbled with their phones, officers rushed forward, and the judge slammed his gavel. Everyone remained seated. Nobody leaves. But Mason already knew. This wasn't just a disappearance. Ethan Ward had a plan. He had studied the courthouse. He knew the exits. And now, the one witness who could identify him was 3 years old and terrified. Avery's small body shook as Ranger pressed closer. She buried her face against his fur, inhaling deeply, as if drawing courage from him. Mason knelt beside her, voice low, calm, precise. "It's okay, Avery. Ranger, here, you're safe. We've got you." The child exhaled a shaky breath and blinked up at him, trusting the dog more than anyone else. Mason had never seen such a profound bond in his life, a connection that transcended words, age, and fear. Ranger's soft, brown eyes met Avery's, filled with quiet reassurance. Detective Ruiz addressed the room, voice loud enough to be heard but steady. "We don't know where he went, but he's in the building. All personnel stay alert. Security teams lock every exit. We'll find him." But Mason knew it wasn't enough. Ethan Ward wasn't reckless. He wasn't desperate. He was methodical, patient, calculating. And now he had realized his small, terrified witness was in the same building. Avery's mother tightened her hold on her daughter's hand, feeling the tremors in her tiny fingers. "She's okay," Julia whispered to Mason. "Please tell me she's okay." Mason swallowed hard. "She's okay for now." Ranger's growl deepened, more insistent this time. Mason followed the dog's gaze along the hallway, noticing a slight shimmer near the ventilation grates. Dust drifted down as though stirred by invisible fingers. Ranger's hackles rose, a warning that set Mason's nerves on edge. "Officer Cole," Judge Holloway said, voice steady but tense, "what is that dog reacting to?" Mason knelt beside Avery, keeping a firm grip on Ranger's leash. "Something up there," he said, eyes scanning the high vents. "Something or someone he senses is a threat. Avery, stay right here." Avery buried her face deeper into Ranger's fur. The child's tiny body was shaking, but Ranger remained calm at her side, chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Mason placed his hand on the girl's shoulder. "Ranger won't let anything happen to you. Not a thing." And in that moment, something clicked inside Avery. She exhaled, voice barely above a whisper. "He came to the window," she said. "I saw him watching." The room went cold. The reporters stopped typing. The marshals froze mid-step. Even the judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Mason's pulse thundered. He knew that meant Ethan Ward hadn't just disappeared. He had been close enough to threaten her, to spy, to manipulate the only witness who could put him away. And now the courthouse, once a place of order, of law, felt like a trap. Avery pressed closer to Ranger. The dog's fur was soft, grounding her, a living shield between her and the unseen threat. Mason noticed her tiny lips tremble as she whispered again. He's scary." Ranger responded by nudging her hand with his nose, letting her know it was okay to be afraid, but that she was not alone. Mason glanced around the room. Officers were sweeping the aisles, reporters were murmuring frantically, and the judge was trying to maintain order. But all Mason could focus on was the small girl clinging to a dog in the middle of a courtroom, and the invisible predator who had vanished into thin air moments ago. "This is not over," Mason muttered under his breath. He tightened his grip on Ranger's leash, eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. Not by a long shot. Avery's whisper came again, this time just 2 words, trembling but clear. "Bad man." Mason felt a chill creep up his spine. It wasn't just fear in her voice, it was certainty. The kind of certainty that only a child who had witnessed danger firsthand could possess. And Ranger's growl deepened in response, low and urgent, warning the entire room that the threat had not passed, and that the predator, Ethan Ward, was still very much inside the building. The judge's gavel hit the bench sharply, but it did little to settle the chaos. Mason knew in his gut that the real test was just beginning. They had a witness. They had a K-9 who could sense the danger, but the criminal had the advantage. Knowledge of the building, knowledge of the law's weaknesses, and a chilling, patient mind that could exploit any moment of hesitation. Avery pressed her tiny face into Ranger's fur, seeking courage. Mason whispered again, steady, calm, unwavering. "You're safe, I've got you. Ranger's got you, we'll find him." But deep down, Mason knew, finding him wouldn't be easy, because Ethan Ward wasn't just hiding in the building. He was already playing the game, and the first move had just been made. And Avery Collins, 3 years old, clutching a stuffed elephant, leaning on a golden retriever, was the only one who could stop him. For now she was silent. But the storm was coming. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath, each second stretching into eternity. Avery's tiny fingers clung to Ranger's golden fur, knuckles white, eyes wide with terror and recognition. She had pointed at Ethan Ward moments ago, and though he had vanished from plain sight, she knew. Somehow, someway, the man she had been trying to forget for months was still here, somewhere in the courthouse, watching, waiting. Detective Ruiz whispered to Mason Cole, voice low but urgent. He shouldn't be here. Security said all entrances were cleared. Mason didn't reply. His eyes never left the second row. He scanned every man, every woman, every figure in the seats, but Ethan Ward had vanished. And yet, Avery's gaze had been precise. Her tiny body had tensed, lips quivering, fingers pointing straight at the empty air. Avery's breath hitched, a staccato rhythm of fear that Ranger mirrored, ears twitching, tail stiff. She whispered again, barely audible, "He, right there." Julia Collins gasped, her voice shook. "Honey, he's gone, I promise, he's gone." But Avery's wide blue eyes never wavered. She was certain. Mason felt a chill. Children that age didn't lie. Children that age didn't make mistakes. And children that had survived something as dark as what Avery had survived, they remembered every detail. Ranger growled softly, low in his chest, a warning that drew the attention of every officer nearby. Mason knelt beside Avery. "It's okay, Avery," he murmured. "Ranger sees him too. You're safe with us." The little girl pressed herself closer to the dog. She drew a shaky breath, and then, in a whisper that carried across the bench despite her size, she said, "Bad man watching." The words sent a ripple through the courtroom. Judge Holloway straightened in his seat, frowning. "Security, lock down this area immediately. All exits." Officers rose, forming a perimeter around the courtroom. But even as they moved with practiced efficiency, Mason's instincts screamed at him. This wasn't just a procedural violation. This was a warning. Ethan Ward was testing them, toying with them, proving he could get inside their sacred walls and unsettle their most vulnerable witness. Ranger's body stiffened. His eyes followed a point beyond the judge, beyond the rows of seats, as if he could see what Mason could not. Mason adjusted his grip on the leash, heart hammering in his chest. And then Mason saw it. A flicker of movement, subtle, deliberate, almost imperceptible behind the last row. A man in a gray hoodie, head down, blending into the shadows. His hands rested loosely on his knees, but his presence screamed intent. This was Ethan Ward. Avery gasped, pressing herself against Ranger. "He, there," she cried, voice louder now, shaking with fear and rage. Her words echoed through the room. Officer Ruiz moved first, striding toward the figure, hand on his holster. "Sir, step away from that area." The man didn't flinch. He didn't even look up. He simply shifted slightly, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips as if he knew something everyone else did not. Mason's stomach dropped. This was more than a confrontation. This was a test, a psychological game. Ethan Ward wanted Avery to panic. He wanted the courtroom in chaos. And the child, so small, so fragile, was the only target who could bring him down if she faltered. Avery's lips trembled. She leaned into Ranger, burying her face in his fur. But then something remarkable happened. The golden retriever nudged her hand with his nose, a gentle, deliberate pressure that seemed to say, "You can do this. You are not alone." Avery exhaled, drawing strength from him. Her blue eyes, wide with terror moments ago, now focused with determination. Mason felt a flicker of hope. The dog wasn't just a companion. He was a shield, a bridge to the courage Avery needed to face what was coming. "Judge," Mason said, voice low but urgent, "she can identify him. She knows him. We have to move carefully. He's dangerous, and she's the only one who can tell us where he went that night." Judge Holloway nodded, tension etched into the lines of his face. "Proceed carefully," he said, "but do not allow anyone to leave the room." The officers tightened the perimeter, and the courtroom shifted into a fragile standstill. The reporters, sensing something monumental, held their breath, pens poised, cameras ready. Every eye was on the little girl, the dog, and the empty space where the man sat or had sat. Avery inhaled, clutching Ellie in one hand and pressing the other against Ranger. "He bad," she whispered again, louder, more urgent. Her voice carried the weight of memory, trauma, and undeniable truth. The courtroom froze. Mason felt it, the kind of silence that wasn't quiet but heavy, loaded with anticipation, fear, and expectation. This wasn't just a missing man. This was a predator who had survived the law once and was testing the boundaries again. And now he was inside the courthouse somewhere and watching. Officer Ruiz gestured toward the exit doors. "Check every corner, every hallway, he can't leave." Mason glanced at Ranger. The dog's posture was rigid, alert, his eyes still locked on the second-row shadows. Mason's gut told him Ethan Ward wasn't planning to flee. He was planning something else, something calculated, something terrifying. Avery whispered again, almost to herself, "He waiting." Her words, fragile as they were, sent a shiver down Mason's spine. Waiting for what? For her to falter, for chaos to erupt, for the court to fail her. The judge's voice cut through the tension. "Miss Collins," he said gently, "can you show us who you're talking about?" Avery's tiny hand shook, pointing straight at the empty second-row seat. Her finger quivered in the air. He sits there, watching." Gasps rippled through the room. Mason's hand tightened on Ranger's leash. The dog growled softly again, low and insistent, a warning that the threat wasn't over. "Security, sweep that area," the judge commanded. Officers moved, checking under benches, behind chairs, and along the walls. Every inch of the courtroom was scanned, and yet the seat was empty. "Vanished." Avery's body tensed. Her lips trembled, words caught in her throat. Ranger pressed against her leg, offering a silent promise that she was not alone. She drew a deep, trembling breath and whispered, "He watching." The repetition, the certainty, made Mason's stomach drop. Ethan Ward wasn't gone. He was somewhere else in the building, somewhere hidden, somewhere calculating his next move. Mason and Ruiz exchanged a glance. They had to act fast. A 3-year-old witness was more than enough to put him away, but only if they could protect her, keep her calm, and extract the truth. "Judge," Mason said quietly, "he's in the building, I know it. Ranger's telling me." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Then we lock it down, every exit, every hallway, no one leaves." Julia clutched Avery, whispering, "It's okay, honey, you're okay." Avery's hand tightened around Ranger's fur. "No bad," she said, voice small but firm. "He watching." Ranger growled again, louder this time, enough to make the officers shift uneasily. Mason's gaze followed the dog's eyes to the ceiling vents. Something flickered up there, shadows dancing across the metal grills. Ranger's tail stiffened. Mason's pulse thundered in his chest. He knew then, Ethan Ward wasn't just hiding, he was observing, waiting, and he was closer than they realized. Avery pressed herself into Ranger's side, trembling but grounded. Mason whispered to her, voice calm, firm, and steady, "We've got you. Ranger's got you. I've got you. You're safe with us." She pressed her face into the dog's fur, eyes squeezing shut. "He's scary," she whispered. Mason swallowed hard. The man in the shadows wasn't just dangerous. He was calculated, patient, and aware of every weakness in the courthouse's defenses. And right now, the only person who could see him clearly was a 3-year-old girl leaning against a golden retriever, trembling, terrified, but refusing to back down. The courtroom, once a place of order and law, had transformed into a battlefield of fear, instinct, and silent observation. And Mason knew, deep down, that the next move would determine everything. Because Ethan Ward wasn't gone, he was waiting. And Avery Collins, so small, so fragile, so courageous, was about to make him pay for underestimating her. The courtroom had emptied in a sense, leaving only the core of the storm. Avery, her mother Julia, Mason Cole, Detective Ruiz, and Ranger. Officers lined the hallways, scanners in hand, radios crackling with reports that led to nothing. The courthouse, an old brick relic of the town, felt suddenly like a labyrinth of shadows. Somewhere inside, Ethan Ward lurked, and every creak, every whisper of the ventilation system seemed amplified, warning that he was close. Avery pressed herself into Ranger's side. The golden retriever's warmth and steady heartbeat beneath her cheek offered her the only comfort in the world. Every muscle in her tiny body trembled. She clutched Ellie, the stuffed elephant, to her chest. Its once soft ear was now a ragged placeholder for a night she could barely admit happened. Mason crouched beside her, voice calm but urgent. "Avery, can you tell me where he went that night? Anything you remember, even a little." Avery's wide eyes flicked toward him and then toward her mother. She hesitated, then whispered almost to herself, "He told me not to talk." Julia's hand shot to her mouth. Mason leaned closer. "It's okay, you're safe. Ranger here will protect you. You can tell us." The girl's fingers tightened on the dog's fur, drawing courage from the living shield beneath her. She swallowed hard, her lips quivering, and then she spoke again. "He in the place, big boxes, pictures, judges hiding." Mason's stomach twisted. The archive vault. Old photographs of the town's officials, many decades old, stored in a locked section rarely accessed. If Ethan Ward had chosen that location, he had studied the building. He had planned his move. He knew where the child who could ruin him would be brought. "Okay," Mason said gently, "can you show me where this place is? Ranger will help you. We'll stay together." Avery nodded, pressing her face into the golden fur once more. Ranger nudged her hand, as if reassuring her that she could do this. He understood. He knew. Julia tried to steady her own racing heartbeat. "Honey, we're going to get through this," she whispered. But inside, fear gnawed at her. That Ethan Ward had invaded their world once was bad enough. That he might be hiding in the same building as her daughter was a nightmare she couldn't fully grasp. Detective Ruiz spoke into his radio, tension cutting his words. "Secure all exits. Anyone not essential to the child's protection must remain outside. SWAT, be on standby." Mason took Avery's hand and guided her carefully down the aisle. Ranger walked ahead, nose low, sniffing the air, ears alert. Every officer in the hallway kept a careful distance but stayed close enough to intervene. The courthouse, normally quiet and orderly, now felt like a stage for a dangerous predator. The air smelled faintly of dust, old paper, and the lingering scent of fear. Avery's eyes scanned every corner, and her steps quickened when she thought she saw a shadow flicker. She whispered softly to Ranger, "Bad scary." Ranger's tail stiffened. Mason noticed his hackles rise just slightly, a warning of danger nearby. It was subtle, but Mason trusted Ranger more than any alarm system, more than any human instinct in that moment. The K-9 had never been wrong. As they approached the hallway leading to the restricted archive section, Mason's pulse quickened. Every step seemed louder, echoing off the walls, announcing their approach. But the child remained focused, clinging to Ranger, determined to help in the only way she could. Avery stopped suddenly, her eyes wide. She pressed her tiny hand to Ranger's fur and whispered, "Here he came before." Mason's eyes narrowed. He crouched, putting his ear near hers. "Show me." The child pointed to a small, barely noticeable vent near the corner. Dust had been disturbed along the floor, faint footprints pressed into the old tile. Mason felt a chill run down his spine. Ethan Ward had been here recently. He had watched. He had planned. Avery took a trembling breath. "I saw him, big shadow, waiting." Mason glanced at Ranger, who gave a soft, almost imperceptible growl. He understood. This was no longer just a witness leading them to a location. This was a live threat, unfolding in real time. Detective Ruiz called quietly into his radio, "We have visual on the hallway. Lock all doors leading to the archives. No one goes in without approval. Repeat, no one goes in." Julia clutched Avery's hand tightly, tears brimming. "It's okay, honey," she whispered. "I'm right here." Avery exhaled, and for the first time in weeks, Mason saw her face relax slightly. Not entirely, but enough to know that Ranger had calmed her, anchored her. They continued down the hall, Ranger at the lead, nose to the floor, tail alert. The little girl's hand remained firm on his fur. Mason felt a strange mix of hope and terror. Hope because the child was moving, communicating, trusting the dog. Terror because the man who had terrorized her was somewhere inside this building, aware of every move. They reached the archive room. The door was heavy, steel-framed, and normally locked. Mason felt the weight of it pressing down, symbolic of the barrier between safety and danger. Avery hesitated, looking up at Ranger. The dog sat, tail wagging gently, offering silent courage. "He hiding," Avery whispered. Mason nodded. "We know, Ranger and I are right here, you're not alone." The child reached for the door handle. Her hand shook violently. Ranger nudged her again, steadying, reassuring. Mason took a deep breath. He knew they were on the precipice of confrontation. Suddenly, a noise echoed from the far end of the hallway, a metallic click. Mason froze. Ranger stiffened. Avery's eyes went wide and Ellie slipped from her grip, tumbling to the floor with a dull thud. "What was that?" Julia whispered, panic rising in her voice. "That," Mason said, voice low and tense, "is not good." He signaled to Ruiz, who drew his weapon quietly. Officers fanned out, checking corners, scanning shadows. Mason's eyes returned to the vent above the hallway. Dust fell in a tiny cascade. Someone had been there. Avery's voice trembled, "He moving." Mason knelt beside her, eyes locked with hers. "It's okay. Ranger and I have you. We will not let him hurt you, I promise." The child exhaled, drawing a deep, shaky breath. Ranger leaned into her, pressing his warm body against hers, offering the only shield she could count on. And then she whispered words that cut through the tension like a blade. "He waiting." The weight of those words settled over everyone present. Mason's jaw tightened. He knew then that Ethan Ward hadn't fled. He hadn't panicked. He had retreated somewhere deeper in the building. He had watched them, calculated their movements, and now he was preparing his next move. Ranger's growl deepened, a low, insistent rumble that vibrated through Mason's chest. The dog was telling him something urgent, dangerous. Mason's eyes scanned every corner, every shadow, every darkened doorway. He realized with a cold certainty that the child's memory, her courage, her precision, her ability to recall where Ward had been, was going to be the only thing that saved them. Avery pressed her face into Ranger's fur, seeking comfort and courage. "He's scary," she whispered again. Mason nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, he is, but you're braver than you know, Avery. We're going to stop him." Detective Ruiz called out, "All units stay alert. SWAT is on the way. Do not approach alone. Keep the child safe." Avery's lips trembled, but she nodded. Ranger nudged her hand, a silent affirmation. Mason could see it. The child had found her courage, anchored in the dog beside her, in the people protecting her. But Mason knew the threat had not passed. It had only intensified. Somewhere in the building, Ethan Ward was calculating his next move, watching, waiting, and the first opportunity he got, he would strike. The archive door loomed before them, steel and shadows, a barrier between the present and a confrontation that could change everything. Mason swallowed hard, feeling the pulse of danger in the air, knowing that the next moments would define whether Avery's courage and Ranger's loyalty would be enough. Avery's whisper came again, barely audible, yet filled with certainty. "He hiding." And Mason knew. They were standing on the edge of something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The courthouse corridors, once orderly and familiar, had become a labyrinth of tension and fear. Mason Cole, Detective Ruiz, Julia Collins, Avery, and Ranger moved carefully toward the restricted archives section, every step measured, every breath calculated. But as they rounded the corner to the last hallway before the archive vault, something felt off, so off that Mason's instinct screamed a warning louder than any alarm. The air was thick. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered sporadically, casting shadows that danced along the walls like specters. Dust hung in the beams of light, disturbed by the subtle vibrations of movement too faint for human ears. Ranger's fur bristled. His tail stiffened, ears pricked sharply, and he let out a low, urgent growl. Avery pressed herself against the dog's side, hiding her face in his fur. Her small body trembled as if she could feel danger crawling along the walls. Ellie, the once pristine stuffed elephant, now ragged and dirt-stained, fell from her hands, thudding against the tile. Mason knelt beside her. "It's okay, Avery. Ranger and I have you. We're right here." The little girl exhaled shakily but didn't release her grip on Ranger. Her blue eyes scanned the hallway, reflecting fear, determination, and something older than her years: survival. Then Mason noticed it, a faint vibration, a slight metallic scrape coming from the ventilation grate above their heads. The sound was so subtle that Ruiz had to lean in to hear it. Dust fell from the grate in a thin cascade, as though stirred by invisible fingers. "What is that?" Julia whispered, her voice trembling. "That," Mason said under his breath, eyes narrowing, "is trouble." The dog's growl deepened, resonating like a warning bell. Ranger's hackles rose, and he pressed closer to Avery, protecting her with a presence that was more human than canine in that moment. Suddenly, a cell phone fell from the vent above, landing on the floor with a faint ping. The screen lit up, displaying a single message. "She talks, I burn it down." Avery screamed, a high-pitched, piercing sound that made Mason's stomach twist. The little girl clutched Ranger, pressing her face into his golden fur. Ranger growled again, louder this time, as if he could sense the full weight of the threat. Mason grabbed the phone, eyes scanning the screen. The message was clear. Someone had rigged the building, or at least had a plan to strike. The message was meant to terrorize them, to paralyze the people protecting Avery. "This isn't just a threat," Ruiz said, voice low but urgent. "He's here, he's in the building, and he's planning something." Avery whimpered, pressing herself tighter into Ranger's side. Mason crouched beside her, hand on her shoulder. "I've got you. Ranger's got you. We will protect you. You're safe." The little girl's breathing slowed slightly, her fear partially anchored by the dog's steady presence. Ranger nudged her hand with his nose, encouraging her to remain calm, to trust him, to survive. Mason scanned the corridor, nodding every shadow, every door, every vent. His gut screamed that Ethan Ward had set something in motion. The courthouse, old and labyrinthine, was a perfect hunting ground for someone calculating and patient. "Detectives," Judge Holloway's voice came through the radio, tense but controlled, "lock down the building. No one in or out. SWAT team, prepare for immediate entry. Mason, keep the child safe. That's your top priority." Mason nodded, turning back to Avery. "We're going to be okay," he whispered, "but we have to move carefully. Can you do that for me?" Avery nodded, her hand tightening on Ranger's fur. The dog shifted slightly, chest rising and falling with calm precision, letting her know she wasn't alone. They moved down the hallway, Ranger leading, nose to the floor, muscles coiled. The corridors were empty, the echo of their footsteps loud and unnerving. Mason's pulse pounded in his ears as he imagined Ethan Ward somewhere in the shadows, watching, waiting, ready to strike. Then Ranger stopped abruptly, ears pricked, body rigid. Mason noticed a slight shimmer in the dust along the wall, something moving, something deliberate. "He's here," Mason muttered, voice tight. Avery pressed her face into the dog's fur. "Bad, scary," she whispered. The metallic click echoed again, louder this time, coming from the vent above. Mason glanced up, heart hammering. It wasn't just a noise, it was a signal, a warning. Someone had been tampering with the vent. Ruiz gestured toward the air grate. Careful, it could be rigged. Mason nodded. He reached into his belt for his flashlight and handgun, illuminating the space above the grate. Dust swirled in the beam, revealing faint scratches and scuff marks. Ethan Ward had been here, had been preparing, had been watching them move. Avery shivered against Ranger. "He moving," she whispered. Mason's jaw tightened. "I know, Ranger knows we're going to stay calm, follow my lead." He signaled Ruiz to sweep the hallway while keeping a perimeter. Julia held Avery's hand, steadying her, offering reassurance. But Mason could see the terror in both their eyes. The threat was palpable, immediate and alive. Suddenly, a loud clanging noise echoed from the far end of the hallway. Mason spun, gun raised. Ranger barked sharply, a single warning note that vibrated through the air. "Everyone stay back," Mason shouted. Avery squeezed Ranger's fur. The dog growled, low and insistent, signaling danger close. Dust fell from the vent in a thin cascade, confirming their worst fears. Ethan Ward was not gone. He was in the building, somewhere above, moving, calculating. Mason's mind raced. He had to keep Avery safe, protect the building, and anticipate every move Ethan Ward could make. But the little girl's courage, anchored by the dog, gave him a sliver of hope. She was small, vulnerable, but she was precise in her memory, accurate in her observations. If anyone could guide them to Ethan Ward, it was Avery and Ranger. Avery whispered again, trembling but determined. "He waiting." Mason swallowed hard. "Yes," he said quietly, voice taut with tension. "He's waiting, but we're ready." Ranger pressed closer to Avery, offering warmth and stability. Mason's hand rested on the dog's back. The child's small fingers clutched the fur tightly, drawing strength from the living shield beside her. A metallic click came again from above, followed by a soft metallic scrape. Mason's heart raced. Ethan Ward was moving, preparing. Every second counted. Ruiz signaled to officers in the hallway. "Sweep the building. Every corridor, every room, every vent. No one leaves, no one." The courthouse, once a place of order and law, now felt like a battlefield. Every shadow, every flicker of movement, every echoing footstep carried danger. Mason felt the weight of responsibility crushing down. Protect the child, anticipate the criminal, neutralize the threat. Avery exhaled slowly, drawing courage from Ranger. "He's scary," she whispered once more, but this time her tone carried determination. Mason nodded, voice low but firm. "Yes, he is, but we've got you. We will stop him." The dog growled again, warning and protective, signaling that the danger was immediate. Mason's pulse pounded. The next move would determine everything. Avery pressed her face into Ranger's fur, trembling but steady. "He hiding," she whispered. And Mason knew Ethan Ward was still in the building, still waiting, still dangerous. But for the first time since they had entered the courthouse that morning, Mason felt a thread of hope. The child was alive, aware, and ready. Ranger was vigilant, loyal, and unflinching. Together, they were a force Ethan Ward had underestimated. The metallic scrape echoed again. Dust drifted from the vents. Mason's jaw tightened. They were closer than anyone realized. And Mason knew that the moment of confrontation was coming. The air in the courthouse had thickened into something almost tangible, a tension that pressed against Mason's chest like steel bands. Ranger led the way, nose to the ground, ears pricked, muscles coiled. Avery clung to him, tiny hands clutching fur as if it were a lifeline. Julia followed close behind, her eyes wide, heart hammering. Detective Ruiz stayed alert, scanning every shadow, every corner, every vent, every whisper of movement. Mason's pulse thundered. Every instinct screamed danger. Ethan Ward was somewhere in this building, watching, waiting. He wasn't reckless, he wasn't panicked. He was calculated, and he was preparing his next move. Ranger stopped abruptly near the stairwell, ears twitching. Mason leaned down, voice low but firm. "He's close, Avery. Ranger can feel it. Stay calm, okay?" Avery nodded, pressing her cheek into the dog's fur. She whispered almost to herself, "He there." Mason's jaw tightened. "I know, we're going to handle this." The first steps down the stairwell were slow, measured, every footfall echoing off the walls. Dust floated lazily in the fluorescent glow, disturbed only by their movement. Ranger's growl deepened, a low, urgent warning. Then a faint metallic scraping sound echoed above them. Mason's pulse jumped. He glanced up. A shadow flickered across the railing of the upper floor, quick, calculated, watching. "Ruiz," Mason whispered, "he's above us. Keep your eyes sharp." Detective Ruiz nodded, hand hovering near his holster. Julia held Avery tightly, whispering reassurances, but her eyes betrayed terror. Mason knew the mother was terrified not just for herself, but for the child who had survived unspeakable trauma and was now about to confront it again. Ranger moved forward, sniffing the air, tail stiff. He suddenly barked, a short, sharp, commanding sound. Mason felt the vibration in his chest. Someone was moving fast, stealthy, trying to avoid detection. "He's trying to escape," Mason muttered under his breath. Avery squeezed Ranger's fur, eyes wide. "No, he bad," she whispered. Mason's jaw clenched. The courthouse, once a place of safety and law, now resembled a maze, every hallway and staircase a potential trap. Dust trailed from the vents above, a telltale sign that Ethan Ward had been following them, orchestrating his movements with deadly precision. They reached the main hallway leading to the north wing. The lights flickered. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls. Mason signaled Ruiz to take point with him. Officers fanned out, forming a protective perimeter around Avery and her mother. A sudden loud clang erupted from the far end of the hallway. Ranger's ears twitched violently. Mason froze, pistol raised. Dust rained down from a vent above. "He's here," Avery whispered, her voice trembling but insistent. Mason's eyes narrowed. "I know, Avery, stay close to Ranger." They moved cautiously forward, each step deliberate. Ranger led, alert to every vibration, every shift in the air. Mason's eyes scanned the corridor, searching for any movement. Then he saw it, a faint shadow flickering across the corner, just out of the beam of the flashlight. "There," Mason shouted, pointing. The shadow darted, fast, deliberate, calculated. Mason fired a warning shot into the ceiling. Ranger barked, charging forward. The chase was on. Ethan Ward bolted down the adjacent hallway, footsteps pounding against tile. Mason and Ruiz sprinted after him, Ranger bounding ahead, ears flat, tail stiff, instincts razor-sharp. Avery pressed against Julia's side, gasping but clinging to the dog's fur. "Go, go," Mason yelled. "Don't let him get away." The corridor twisted, staircases branching off unpredictably. Dust and debris kicked up as Ethan Ward's movements echoed off the walls. He was fast, agile, and familiar with the layout of the building. Avery, gripping Ranger's fur, whispered, "Stop him." Mason's heart pounded. She was right. They had to stop him. But he was more than just fast. He was dangerous, unpredictable. Every instinct told Mason that the moment they cornered him would be the most critical moment of all. They reached the stairwell to the upper floor. Ethan Ward bolted up, 2 steps at a time. Ranger leapt after him, growling. Mason and Ruiz followed, adrenaline fueling every muscle. At the top of the stairs, the hall stretched into the north wing. Doors lined the walls, vents above rattling ominously. Ranger sniffed the air, then bolted toward a heavy metal door at the far end. Mason ran, pistol raised, heart hammering. Avery's small voice whispered urgently, "He hiding." Mason nodded. "I know, stay calm, Avery. Ranger and I are right here." The metal door was partially ajar. Ranger's hackles raised. Mason carefully nudged the door, peering inside. A small storage room, boxes stacked high, shadows filling every corner. And there, movement. Ethan Ward. He froze when he saw the dog, eyes narrowing, lips curling into a twisted smirk. but Mason could see the tension in his shoulders. He had underestimated Ranger, and more importantly, Avery. "Get her out," Mason shouted to Ruiz and Julia, guiding Avery behind him. Ranger positioned himself between the child and the intruder, body low, growl deep and threatening. Ethan Ward lunged, calculating, aiming to reach past the dog. Ranger responded instantly, biting at the air near his hand, forcing him to recoil. Mason stepped forward, gun trained, ready for the confrontation that could end in disaster. Avery, small and trembling, whispered again, "He bad." Mason swallowed hard. "Yes, he is, but you're safe. Ranger's got you, I've got you." Ethan Ward froze, scanning the room, weighing his options. He realized he had been trapped, cornered by a child and a dog, an impossibility he hadn't anticipated. Rage and fear flickered across his face. Ranger growled again, a deep, steady warning, as if telling Mason that the next second would decide everything. Avery pressed herself closer to the dog. Her blue eyes, wide with terror and determination, reflected the moment's intensity. She was small, but she had seen him. She remembered everything, and now she was about to help stop him. The air crackled with tension. Every officer, every heartbeat, every movement counted. Ethan Ward had underestimated the smallest witness, but Mason knew in that moment that the predator's reign of terror was about to meet its match. Dust floated in the air, lights flickered, Ranger's growl resonated, and Avery whispered, voice trembling but resolute, "Know him, stop." The words hung in the room, simple, fragile, yet powerful enough to carry the weight of truth, courage, and survival. And Mason knew the confrontation was imminent. Ethan Ward's next move would decide everything. The metal door loomed like a threshold to a storm. Mason Cole's heart pounded as Ranger's low growl filled the small storage room. Avery pressed against the dog, trembling yet unwavering. She had seen him, remembered every detail. And now, in this tense, suspended moment, she was about to face the man who had haunted her nightmares. Ethan Ward's eyes glinted in the dim light. His body tensed, ready to strike, yet uncertainty flickered in his gaze. He had underestimated the child. He had underestimated the dog. And now he was trapped, cornered by a trio he hadn't anticipated. Mason, a veteran detective, Ranger, a living shield, and Avery, a 3-year-old witness whose courage eclipsed her size. Mason took a measured step forward, gun raised but aimed to intimidate, not harm. "Ward," he said, voice steady, every syllable controlled. "It's over, step away." Ward smirked, lips curling, calculating. "Over? You think a little girl and a dog can stop me?" His voice was low, oily with menace. "I've been careful, patient. I've planned everything. And you," he gestured at Mason and the officers now pressing the hallway behind him, "you just walked into my trap." Ranger barked sharply, a warning, charging forward and cutting off any route Ward might take. Avery clutched the dog's fur, wide-eyed but resolute. Her tiny voice rose above the tension. "Bad man." The words were small but seismic. Ward froze, a flicker of recognition passing across his face. He had counted on fear, chaos, hesitation, but he hadn't counted on the child remembering. She had seen him. She had survived him, and in that memory lay his downfall. Mason stepped closer, slowly, deliberately, ensuring the dog stayed between Avery and Ward. "You're not going anywhere," Mason said, voice firm. "You're done." Ward's lips tightened. He glanced at the dog, calculating. Ranger didn't move. His eyes locked on Ward's, unwavering, alert. The growl vibrated in the room, low and threatening, warning Ward that any sudden movement would be met with force. Avery's small hand trembled as she pressed it into Ranger's fur. "Know him," she whispered, almost a plea, almost a command. "Stop." Ward's expression faltered. He hadn't expected this. Not the defiance, not the courage, not the dog's loyalty, not the child's precision in identifying him. Mason's eyes never left Ward. Every muscle in his body was tense, ready to react. "Ward," he said calmly but with the weight of inevitability. There's nowhere to run. There's nowhere to hide. Avery has seen you. You're done. Ward's gaze flicked to the vent above, calculating escape routes. His mind raced, but every move, every option was blocked. Ranger's presence made him hesitate. Avery's memory made him falter. Mason's weapon made him think twice. Suddenly, Ward lunged, not at the officers, not at Mason, but to reach behind a stack of boxes, a desperate grab for some hidden object. Ranger reacted instantly, barking, moving in front of Avery, teeth snapping just inches from Ward's hands. The man recoiled, startled, caught off guard. Avery's voice rose in a scream, sharp and clear. "No, stop him." The words carried weight beyond their volume. They were precise, charged with memory, fear, and a child's unwavering truth. Ranger responded, pressing forward, herding Ward back toward the center of the room. Mason moved quickly, covering Ward with his gun, voice commanding, "Step away from the boxes. Hands where I can see them." Ward's eyes darted, wild now, calculating escape. But the room was too small, too confined. Ranger's growl vibrated like a drumbeat of justice. Avery clutched the dog, trembling but unwavering, repeating, "Bad man, stop." The sound of officers moving in from the hallway added pressure. Ward realized he had no options. Every exit blocked, every route cut off. He glanced at the child, and for the first time, hesitation flickered in his eyes. "You'll regret this," he hissed, voice low but dangerous. "You think a kid can control this. You think." "You're done, Ward," Mason interrupted, voice calm but final. "Step back now." Ranger barked sharply, the sound resonating through the room, vibrating through Ward's chest. Avery's small hands clutched the dog's fur, and for the first time, Ward realized the depth of the child's memory, courage, and connection to the dog. He stepped back slowly, hands raised in surrender, eyes darting between Mason, Ruiz, and the small figure clinging to the dog. The reality hit him. His plans had failed. The witness was alive, alert, and precise. The predator was trapped. Avery's voice, small but firm, broke the silence. "Bad man, stop." The words echoed, clear and resolute, cutting through the tension. Mason nodded at Ruiz. "Now move in." Officers surged forward, surrounding Ward. He tried to resist, tried to calculate one last desperate escape, but Ranger's presence, Avery's unwavering eyes, and Mason's authority left him no chance. Within seconds, Ward was restrained, handcuffed, and removed from the room. Avery's body shook, but not just from fear, also from relief. She pressed against Ranger, wrapping her arms around him, whispering, "Good boy." Ranger nuzzled her gently, tail wagging softly as if acknowledging her bravery. Mason crouched beside them. "You were incredible, Avery. You helped stop him." Julia's tears flowed freely now, clutching her daughter to her chest. "I can't believe it," she whispered. "I can't believe you did this." Avery pressed her face into the dog's fur, inhaling deeply. "He gone," she said simply, eyes wide but calm. Mason's gaze followed the officer's, removing Ward. "Gone," he echoed, though the word felt heavy with truth and relief. For the first time in months, Avery could breathe. For the first time, the nightmare that had haunted her since she was 3 seemed to recede. Ranger remained beside her, vigilant but calm, grounding her, offering courage, warmth, and protection. Julia turned to Mason, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for keeping her safe." Mason nodded, glancing down at Avery. "She did more than I ever could. She was brave, precise, and she remembered. That's what saved her." Avery smiled faintly, hugging Ranger tightly. Her small voice, soft but full of triumph, whispered, "No bad man." The courtroom and hallway beyond were now secure. Officers checked for any lingering threats, radios buzzing, but Mason knew the danger had passed. Ward's reign of terror was over, and the child's courage, memory, and bond with the dog had made it happen. Ranger sat obediently beside Avery, offering silent reassurance. Mason knelt, placing a hand on the dog's back, then another on Avery's shoulder. "You were amazing, both of you," he said. Avery leaned against Ranger, a mixture of exhaustion and relief washing over her tiny frame. Julia held her close, whispering comforting words, but the reality of what had just happened, the terror, the chase, the confrontation, hung heavily in the air. Mason looked at the courthouse around them, lights flickering, dust still settling. The building had witnessed a storm of fear, courage, and resilience. And at the center of it all, a 3-year-old girl and a golden retriever had stood firm against a predator who had haunted her life. Avery looked up at Mason, eyes wide, voice small but clear. "He stop." "Yes," Mason said softly, voice steady. "He stopped, you're safe." The dog nudged her hand gently, tail wagging. Avery smiled faintly, pressing herself against him. For the first time in months, the terror that had shadowed her life was gone. And for Mason, Ruiz, and Julia, the reality was clear. Bravery didn't always come from size or strength. Sometimes it came from memory, love, and a bond that couldn't be broken. Avery's courage had saved them all. But even as Ethan Ward was led away, Mason couldn't shake the thought. The world was full of shadows. Some predators could be caught, some dangers lurked unseen. And it took extraordinary courage and extraordinary allies to survive. For now, though, the child, the dog, and the people who had sworn to protect her had won. And in that small, trembling, yet unbreakable victory, hope finally glimmered. The courthouse felt almost serene now, though the echoes of chaos still lingered in its hallways. Ethan Ward was gone, restrained, and in the custody of law enforcement, yet the tension in the air refused to dissipate entirely. Mason Cole, Detective Ruiz, Julia Collins, and Avery remained in the storage room, the golden retriever, Ranger, sitting loyally beside the little girl, tail flicking occasionally. The crisis had passed, but the aftermath, the emotional weight of what had occurred, still pressed heavily upon everyone present. Avery, still trembling, leaned against Ranger, her tiny fingers gripping his fur as if it were the only thing holding the world together. Julia crouched beside her, tears running freely, hugging her daughter tightly. "You were so brave," she whispered, voice breaking. "I can't believe how strong you were." The child looked up at her mother, blue eyes wide and uncertain. "I scared," she admitted softly. Her voice was small, almost lost in the enormous silence that had fallen over the room. "Yes," Julia said gently, pressing her forehead to Avery's. "I know, but you stayed strong, you saved yourself. You saved everyone." Ranger nudged Avery's hand, a gentle reminder that she was never truly alone. Mason crouched beside them, placing a reassuring hand on the dog's back. "You did it, Avery. You remembered everything. You told us what he did, where he was hiding, and how he moved. You helped us stop him." The little girl's eyes flicked toward the doorway, toward the hallway where officers were securing the building. Watching," she whispered. Mason shook his head, voice steady. "No, he's gone now, you're safe. Ranger, here, I'm here. Your mom's here, nobody's watching anymore." Avery exhaled, a small, tremulous breath that seemed to carry the tension out of her body. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt a fragment of safety. She pressed herself closer to Ranger, drawing courage from the warmth and stability of the dog beside her. Julia kissed the top of her daughter's head. "You were amazing, honey, absolutely amazing." Mason allowed himself a small, exhausted smile. He had seen countless cases, dealt with dangerous criminals, and faced situations that tested every limit of his endurance, but few moments had carried the intensity of what they had just endured. And yet, in the midst of fear, uncertainty, and adrenaline, one thing had shone brighter than anything else: Avery's courage. "Do you want to tell me what you were thinking when you saw him?" Mason asked gently, crouching to her level. Avery clutched Ranger tighter, hesitating. Then, in a soft but determined voice, she whispered 2 words. "Stop him." The room fell silent. Julia's eyes widened, tears pricking at the corners. Mason's pulse quickened. Those two words, so simple, so small, so profound, carried more power than anyone had realized. They encapsulated months of fear, terror, and trauma, yet also a clarity, a purpose that no adult could have imposed. Stop him. Not just the man, not just the immediate danger. Stop the fear, stop the nightmare, reclaim the world from terror. Detective Ruiz exhaled slowly, shaking his head in awe. She said it all, he murmured almost reverently. Ranger barked softly, as if agreeing, as if acknowledging that those two words had guided them through the darkness. Avery looked up at the dog, eyes still wide but filled with a new light, relief, recognition, and pride. Julia pressed her hand over Avery's, holding both of them close. "You did stop him," she whispered, voice thick with emotion. "You really did." Mason nodded, voice steady. "And Ranger helped. You weren't alone. You had an ally who never left your side, who helped you through it." The golden retriever nudged Avery's hand with his nose again, tail wagging gently. The child hugged him tightly, whispering, "Good boy." Outside the storage room, officers continued to clear the building, radios crackling, footsteps echoing in the distant hallways. Mason and Ruiz exchanged a glance. The danger was truly over, yet the story, the memory of it, would linger forever. "Mom," Avery whispered, looking up at Julia. "No bad, stop." Julia nodded, tears spilling freely now. "Yes, baby, he stopped, you're safe." Avery exhaled, pressing her cheek into Ranger's fur, drawing courage and comfort from him. Mason felt a surge of respect and awe for the child. She had faced a predator with nothing but memory, instinct, and a golden retriever's loyalty, and she had prevailed. Mason's mind wandered briefly to the months of investigation, the planning, the fear, the nights spent worrying about how a 3-year-old could possibly survive the horrors she had endured. And now, here she was, small but triumphant, safe, alive, and victorious. Detective Ruiz cleared his throat, breaking the quiet. "We need to get statements, secure evidence, and make sure the building is fully cleared. But she's incredible. I've never seen anything like it." Mason nodded. "Neither have I, but the most important part, she's okay, she's alive, she's safe." Avery lifted her face from Ranger, blinking, small lips curving into a faint smile. "Stop him," she whispered again. Mason smiled, a quiet, relieved smile. "Yes, you did, Avery. Yes, you did." Julia hugged her daughter tightly, rocking her slightly. "You were brave beyond words," she whispered, voice breaking. "You saved so many people." The little girl pressed her forehead against Ranger's soft fur, inhaling deeply. "Good boy," she whispered again, reinforcing the bond that had saved her life more than once. Ranger responded with a gentle nuzzle, tail wagging, grounding her in the moment. Mason watched them for a moment, feeling the weight of everything that had just transpired. This was more than a story of crime or danger. It was a story of courage, memory, and loyalty. It was a story of survival, of trust, and of the quiet, unshakable power of a child and a dog united against darkness. Outside the storage room, the courthouse slowly returned to normal operations. Officers whispered to each other, reporters began to take notes, and cameras captured moments of relief and reunion. But inside the room, the small bubble of safety remained. Avery, Julia, Mason, and Ranger, connected by trauma, courage, and the shared triumph over fear. Avery looked up at Mason, small hands clutching Ranger's fur. "He gone." "Yes," Mason said softly, smiling. "He's gone, you're safe, you did it." The child nodded, small body still trembling but steadying, the words echoing in the room. "Stop him." Those two words, so simple, carried the weight of months of fear, terror, and survival. They had guided the actions of everyone in the room. They had changed the course of events. They had ended a nightmare. Ranger nudged Avery gently, as if to remind her that her courage had saved them all, that she had been the guide through darkness. Avery hugged the dog tightly, whispering, "Good boy." Julia pressed a kiss to her daughter's head. "You're amazing, Avery. Absolutely amazing. Mason nodded, feeling a sense of closure, of triumph, of something almost sacred. The predator is stopped, he said quietly, voice steady. And the hero, she's right here. Avery smiled faintly, hugging Ranger again. Her tiny voice, trembling but victorious, whispered one final time. Stop him. And in that moment, the courthouse, the officers, the detectives, and the mother all understood. The courage of a small child, guided by memory, truth, and loyalty, had triumphed over darkness. The predator was gone. The child was safe. And though the scars would remain, so would the unbreakable bond between a girl and her dog, and the knowledge that even the smallest voice, the smallest action, could make all the difference. The world outside the courthouse would continue, filled with its ordinary chaos and danger. But inside this room, in this moment, a little girl and a golden retriever had changed everything. Two words, whispered with courage and certainty, had turned terror into triumph. Stop him. And that was enough.